FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You're listening to the Financial Survival Network. It's Kerry, Lutz, and probably heard a lot about what's going on with the Iran nuclear agreement. Is it for real? Is it just a piece of paper? Has the president and Secretary of State John Kerry really accomplished something meaningful? What about Congress's say in it? Well, Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty, the Independent Institute, with us here to have his say about it. Ivan, good to have you back. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Kerry. Glad to be back.
So this agreement, do you think it has legs, or do you think it's total capitulation to the mullahs in Iran who have quite a history behind them?
Well, I think it's a promising endeavor. They still haven't gotten the final agreement. They have a preliminary agreement, which went farther. The Iranians went farther than I thought they would. The question is, can they get the details nailed down? And in these things, details are very important, like what will be the circumstances of the inspections? Will we be able to inspect Iranian Iranian military bases? That's one of the issues. When will the sanctions be pulled off? Iran wants them pulled off immediately. The U.S. is not so, wants to see some progress. So there's still issues there. What this basically does is limits the Iranians' capability to break out and go turn a peaceful nuclear program into a bomb-making program, and they want to have a year's warning, and now they're down to a few months, so they want to back this up to a year, so they know if Iran wants to get a nuclear weapon, that they'll have a year, be able to tell by inspections and limiting their uranium centrifuges and their capacity to do peaceful Iranian nuclear efforts, so that they can have this warning time, increase the warning time if Iran should want to get a nuclear weapon. And of course, excuse me, U.S. intelligence has said that they don't think that Iran has made the decision to do that. Iran could do what Japan has done, is go all the way, get everything ready so that they could go to make a nuclear weapon pretty rapidly. But of course, that's not the same as having a nuclear weapon that you can use. So I think this agreement does have potential. We have to negotiate with our enemies sometimes, or people that we don't like. And I think if you can get a good verification and inspection regime with this agreement, it's a good thing.
Do you think these guys are particularly trustworthy here? I mean, they've been a pretty much self-avowed enemy of the U.S., of Israel, of our other allies here in the Middle East. Like they pretty much taken over Yemen recently. I mean, you really think they're sincere here in trying to reach a deal?
Well, I think if any power I would be more scared of is North Korea. They're very erratic. The Iranians, we don't like some of the things that they do, but they're usually pretty careful about how they go about it. When you say they take over Lebanon, I think the Saudis think they have, but I think they probably have less influence there than they have. They're putting some money in there, clearly, and maybe even some weapons that we interdicted at sea. And they've also gained influence, but part of their gain in influence in that region was the fact that the U.S. invaded and took out their major adversary, Saddam Hussein, who was, of course, no nice guy, but he was a barrier to a more powerful country, which is Iran. So they're going to be a regional power. And yes, they don't get along with the Israelis very well, but we have to remember that the Israelis are the dominant power in that region. They have 200 to 400 nuclear weapons already. So I think the Israelis can take care of themselves. And so I don't see improved relations with Iran as necessarily undermining Israeli security.
I mean, just today, the Iranians seized an American ship with 34 sailors on board. I mean, is this the spirit of cooperation?
Well, no. I mean, you're going to have issues here and there with the Iranians. And I think we have issues with other countries here and there. But I think all this is sort of gamesmanship in the final negotiations. They've also are holding a Washington Post reporter, and I think he's sort of the Iranians will do anything to get a better deal, and whether they'll get that deal in the end is a question that's still up in the air. But I think certainly countries oppose one another in one area and cooperate in other areas. Like we've been cooperating for a long time with the Russians in Afghanistan. They've been letting us transport our troops through their airspace and on the ground, and yet we oppose them over the Ukraine and Crimea. So I think you have to work with countries if you can work with them in certain areas. And I think the Iran nuclear agreement pretty much should stand on its own, that we don't want this country to get nuclear weapons. That's why we're doing it, because we don't think Iran is a country that we want to have nuclear weapons. So that's the purpose of the agreement. So I don't think there's anybody, even Obama administration, I don't think has starry eyes in the fact that the Iranians are a wonderful country. Of course, they're more democratic than some of our allies, like the Saudis, but they're still not a complete democracy. This Khamenei, he's still the strongman ruler. He has some democratic elements in his society, but you can't always pick who you want to negotiate with. And the Iranian population, I think, is very favorable to the United States.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. What is the Iranian government's relationship right now with their population? We've seen mass protests throughout the years that have been brutally put down. Is this agreement going to strengthen the Iranian government's position regarding their population, or what's going to happen there?
Well, I think actually this agreement will probably end up undermining them. Now, they need sanctions relief because their economy is under some pressure, but they don't want too many sanctions relief because, remember, autocrats usually gain from shutting their countries off from other countries, and this might thaw the relationship if you get sanctions are eased or even eliminated because of this. That country is going to be thrown back into the international system. Now they want that to some extent because they need money and they want to sell their oil, etc. That also creates a political problem for the regime because they do have a restive population that's fairly pro-U.S. and also there have been protests in elections that the population didn't think were fair and that sort of thing in the past. So this regime is not exactly really fortified in power. So I think any opening to the outside world probably eliminates the excuse which the regime would have with if you tighten sanctions or if you even attack them because of their nuclear program. That's rally around the flag. That would happen in any country. If somebody attacked the United States and you didn't particularly like Obama, you'd probably rally to his side to defend the country. And I think that's the same way, whether it's an economic attack with sanctions or if it's a military attack because of the nuclear program. So I think this agreement would probably undermine the regime rather than strengthen it.
Interesting. And we kind of draw a parallel to Cuba on this as well, with the opening up of American relations with Cuba. What do you think is going to happen in Cuba as a result?
Well, I think you're quite right, there are some similarities. And I think Iran, of course, is more of a threat than Cuba is. But we have to ask ourselves on one more point on the Iran thing is, Iran is mainly a threat to Israel, the Arab countries around it, or perhaps Europe if they would ever get a missile that could take a nuclear weapon and to that range. But it's not primarily a threat to the U.S. Cuba is not a threat to the U.S. anymore. They're destitute. The fire's gone out of their communist revolution. And I think they're going to pull them off the terrorist list because they really haven't supported a lot of revolutionaries that you could call terrorists, in the last few years. So I think this poor country, if it ever was much of a threat at all, it probably was a threat during the Cold War. But that's long since been over. And I think Cuba is even less of a threat than Iran to the United States. And there's no reason. We don't like the Castro brothers, but this is an example of the rally around the flag effect. How many presidents have American presidents had the Castro brothers outlasted simply because they can use the foreign threat that the U.S. is trying to get rid of them to rally the Cuban people. And I think, in this particular case, if your policy hasn't worked for the last 50 some years, it's time to try something new.
And I think that the effect here at home of these sanctions against other countries starting to wear pretty thin here as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of groups that would like to, trade with Cuba, specifically American agricultural interests, but there's other interests as well. There could be Cuba was a vacation paradise before the Castro brothers took over. A lot of Americans had investments and things in hotels, et cetera, down there. So that presumably might, if they ever got the sanctions, taken down, that would probably happen again because it's a natural vacation spot for Americans and that sort of thing. So I think, perhaps, and that's another thing. I think you get trade in there, you get new ideas. That's bad for the Castro brothers because they can see the outside world. And I think Cubans, to some extent, are already familiar with what's outside. And I think they probably would just as well get rid of the Castro brothers as we would. But the question is how to do that. And our policy of reinforcing the Castro brothers by this rally around the flag effect when the U.S. puts sanctions or makes threats militarily or covert action against Cuba. This rallies the population around the Castro brothers where they might not like the economic system because obviously they're being oppressed both politically and economically. But the question is, when we have countries like this, what should you do? And it's sort of counterintuitive because you don't want to reward them. But on the other hand, if the way to get rid of them is to get new ideas and new money flowing into their new relationships from the outside. A lot of these dictators don't want that. And I think, it's somewhat counterintuitive because we have this tendency, well, these guys are thugs. We want to punish them. And, that's all well and good, I guess. But if it reinforces them, then you're not really having the effect that you want to have on them.
So maybe in Cuba's case, an army of American tourists, hundreds of thousands of them, is going to be far more effective than an army of armed Marines storming the beach, right?
Yeah, I really don't think. I think that's kind of outmoded. The Cold War is over. They're not a threat anymore at all. And you can say Iran is a threat in some respects, but I don't know how you would say Cuba is a threat. Their armed forces aren't worth anything. They don't foment revolution around the hemisphere anymore, or even over in Africa during the Cold War. They were doing some of that. So they don't really do that anymore. So I think, we don't really like their leaders, but sometimes Americans have this idea that we need to convert everybody to our system. And perhaps we should do that by example instead of, trying to undermine countries by either economic sanctions, covert action, or military sanctions, because I think it has a counterproductive effect.
Yeah, and maybe at one time the U.S. did have the moral high ground, but these days you really have to wonder.
Right. And there's a lot of pressure from other countries in the hemisphere say, you guys have been doing this for over 50 years. It hasn't worked. And we think there's time for a new policy. So we're taking a lot of pressure from other countries in the region, even our friends.
Yeah. And getting a consensus here at home. I mean, you do have a lot of interest groups, and a lot of it comes down to money. It's Wall Street holding these defaulted or repudiated Cuban bonds. It's the mob wanting compensation for the casinos that were expropriated. It's the Cuban nationals who fled here, who had property that was seized. A lot of interests. It's the sugar lobby who doesn't want unfair competition coming from Cuba. And somehow you have to get all of these interests on the same page and meld a policy that's going to work for the U.S. And so far, it's been impossible. So, while I don't approve of the imperial presidency, go it alone and basically screw the other branches. In this case, how else do you do it?
Well, I think once you allow some trade and investment and loosening as Obama's doing, I think there are other interests that'll come along, agricultural interests, business interests like tourism, et cetera, that will act as a lobby on the other side. So I think once you get the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak, first you have the head of the camel, then you have the whole camel under the tent. And I think that, people are getting interested. And I think there may be other lobbying groups that are pushing on the other side now that they see some daylight. For years, there was just Cuba was a no-go zone. It was very prohibited. And the Miami Cubans had a lock on the policy now, but you have as many more Puerto Ricans in Florida who vote, who are more receptive to opening for Cuba. And even some of the younger Cubans are more receptive towards changing the policy because they're not from the generation that escaped Cuba. And so they don't have as strident of feelings against the Castro brothers. And some of these people have legitimate beefs against the Castro brothers, and I don't blame them for calling them thugs. But the question is, from a national policy, what's the best for the country, and also for, I would say, the best chance of changing Cuba? I think it's probably opening Cuba rather than the embargo, because the embargo sure hasn't worked. It's had the opposite effect of the rally around the flag effect.
And it's the biggest island in the Caribbean. It's 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. Like you said, the Cold War is over. And what benefit do we really derive as a country having this embargo, having sanctions, and forbidding the entire country from going there? And like you say, the trade aspects of it, cigars, sugar, really it's become a big protection racket for the domestic sugar industry.
Right, exactly.
Which pollutes huge swaths of the state of Florida, which is the largest sugar producer in the sugar producing state in the country. And to what end? It just makes no sense. And also, there's so many unintended consequences from this embargo that it's just outlived its usefulness. And I just see, Iran, there's arguments that it's not in the national interest to be trading with them and have a wide open relationship. But Cuba, certainly, whatever arguments there were in the early 60s, most of them are gone. And really, the wounds that were, existent then have mostly healed. And this is like a traditional thing. Most people, if you asked why the embargo exists, why you can't travel to Cuba, I wonder how many people in the street would be able to tell you why it's going on.
Yeah, I mean, this policy was created under Eisenhower. And so, many people in the United States weren't alive then. And so they certainly don't remember why we had such bad relationships with Cuba. And so I think that's helping to ease the embargo here in the United States as well. Yeah,
for sure. And I guess what other countries do we have trade embargoes with, or some type of uneasy relations? I guess Venezuela, but we theoretically have relations with them, maybe not cordial.
Yeah, we don't like them because they're very socialist and that sort of thing. And they had they have Chavez, and now they have his successor there. And we don't like their system. But the problem with these countries is that the U.S. should lead by example, I think, instead of saying, well, we're not going to trade with you because you're not a democratic society or whatever. There's lots of non-democratic societies. And certainly we're a little hypocritical. And I think people recognize this overseas from foreign countries because we support countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, which are dictatorships. Saudi Arabia is a human rights nightmare. And I would say that Iran is more democratic than Saudi Arabia. And yet, we support countries like that. And that's only one example. So we sort of promote democracy where it's convenient for us. But in other respects, if we think we need oil from these countries or whatever, some other thing that we really need them, we kind of quickly forget about, promoting democracy in that country.
Yeah, so it's the inconsistencies. There's no consistency in the foreign policy. It's if you have something we need, then almost any sin will be forgiven. But otherwise, I don't know what the unifying theme of American foreign policy is, and I think that's something that your columns really, Ivan, illustrate and really underscore so well, is that there is no underlying theme in American foreign policy and in our relationships with other countries. And that's what's becoming so disturbing and what's making it impossible for the country to get along with other countries around the world.
Yeah, and it's a real problem in the television age because you have, for instance, this ISIS group, not much of a threat to the United States, more of a threat regionally, whereas Al-Qaeda is more of a threat to the U.S. Well, of course, a couple Americans got their heads chopped off, and overnight the public started becoming more interventionist. We really have to have a president with a coherent vision of what we want to do in the world, and I think we need to, the public needs to speak on this at election time because I think in general, the public is fairly reasonable on these things and probably wonders why we go into places like Libya and try to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi or get bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan was a little bit more understandable after 9/11, but Iraq, of course, was a mystery to most people, I think, but they supported it because the Bush at the time wanted to do it. And most of the time, the American people will support the president if they, after a disaster like 9/11, but something like Libya that Obama did, I think people were scratching their heads a little bit on that one, but no one really cared that much because wars to America are not on our own soil. They're in some far-flung place. So, people the costs of war are not very high. They are in tax money, of course, but that sort of gets blended together. People complain about their general tax bill, but they don't really know how much is going to these foreign wars. I mean, we spent $3.37 trillion on Afghanistan and Iraq alone. If people knew that, that's 1/6 of the national debt of $18 trillion. So that's a sizable amount. And I think, if people knew that more, they see casualties, but it only really affects 1% of the population that's in the military because we don't have a draft anymore. So to the general population, the costs of these things seem manageable. Now, of course, if you're a family of the person that got killed or maimed in one of these wars, you're probably thinking, boy, it sure cost me a lot. But as I say, that's not common among the population.
Yeah, the costs are highly theoretical. Unless you're an expert in monetary policy and federal debt, they mean nothing to you because you never had to sacrifice. It wasn't like World War II. Anyway, Ivan, got to run. Tell us best place to find your writing and your books.
Well, my latest book is The Failure of Counterinsurgency, which talks about some of these topics that we've been talking about. And then my website is www.independent.org.
All right. And as always, you find the links in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter. Ivan, pleasure as always. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.